This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I am your host, Jared Turner, longtime resident of China, co-founder of Mandarin Companion Graded Readers, Chinese blogger, and I'm having a quarantine party this weekend, and none of you are invited. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese grammar wiki, Sinosplice.com, and thinks jokes about menstrual cycles are not funny. Period. In this episode, guest interview is with Jason Schuurman, COO of Yoyo Chinese. His enthusiasm is not only infectious, he also has some great insights about learning Chinese, which John and I will discuss after his interview. This podcast is slightly different than previous podcasts, so let us know what you think. And while you're at it, help us out by emailing or texting this episode with a friend learning Chinese. Let's get to it. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming at you live from Utah.
Hey guys, I'm John Pasden in Shanghai, China.
All right, John, we have got a different show today. And before we get into that, we have a couple reviews. Now, John, you found one of these podcast platforms that I haven't looked at. It's podchaser.com, and we had 2 reviews on here, so we're going to read them.
All right.
Okay, our first review, it's from Stephanie Fukio? Sorry.
Hold on. Think of Italian words, like zucchini.
Oh, man, I'm terrible. I see this work. Anyway, Stephanie Fukio. Let's just say that. All right. Stephanie, been hearing about John and Jared's language footprint here in China a while, but it didn't click that they had a podcast, website, et cetera, until I was reading the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader for the Monkey's Paw a few weeks ago. A coworker of mine mentioned Sinosplice, mentioned Sinosplice, and the Chinese Grammar Wiki, and this You Can Learn Chinese podcast. And I've been listening like a mad woman since then. She's gone mad. It is that good. As they mention it in the podcast, it's not a teaching podcast, but more of a motivational one. The interviews with Mandarin Chinese users are relaxed and inspirational. In full disclosure, it is similar to what we do at the GeoPats podcast language show, but they have way more knowledge and ability in the language than I do. So it definitely has a different flair. I listened to the Steve Kaufman interview yesterday, and it was magical. I have heard Steve talk about his own heavy reading language learning methods for ages on YouTube and such, but never knew about his lumber business that gave him the motivation to learn a few of his 10 to 15 languages. This is the kind of language story gem that they will give breathing room for in these conversations. They also have other segments like rants or raves and well-deserved plugs for the graded readers I've mentioned above. As a former language teacher of 10 plus years, I'm very picky on my language learning content. The recycling of lexis, common sentence patterns, and visual clues they have in these books are top-notch. Well, thanks, Stephanie. That was quite the review.
Wow, thanks a lot.
And we appreciate it.
Okay, and I have another review here from Craig Kiesling. He says, I just started listening at episode 20 and plan to go back and listen to the previously published episodes. It's not a Learn Chinese podcast per se, but rather a How to Learn Chinese podcast, it seems, with interviews with teachers, etc. There's also a rant and rave segment, which is really cool, open in general. For example, one fellow raved about an app, someone raved about the niceness of native Chinese speakers to Chinese language learners, etc. So far, it's enjoyable and seems helpful. All right, well, thanks, Craig. I think I'm the one fellow. Jared, you're the other fellow.
Okay. We'll take it. Well, we appreciate that, guys. And if you want to write us a review, let us know what you think of our show. Even if you hate it, we'll read it on the podcast.
Will we?
Well, we read like a love note to me last one, so.
Yeah, but that's because that was a love note to you, Jared. Let's be honest. I know who chose that one.
Well, okay. I liked it, so whatever.
Okay, so today we're going to mix up the format, right? What you think is coming next is not what's coming next.
Nope. Because what's coming next is an interview.
All right, so we're going to do the interview first today. And today's interviewee is my friend, Jason Schuurman, who currently works for Yoyo Chinese. He's been there for a number of years now. But back in the day, we actually worked together at Chinese Pod. When he lived in Shanghai, we used to hang out. I remember we played Magic the Gathering on PS3. We had beers and talked about Chinese and learning. Yeah, let's just have the interview.
My name is Jason Schuurman. I'm from Michigan in the U.S., from a town called Grand Rapids.
With such an all-American background, You'd never guess Jason has spent such a large portion of his life in the Chinese-speaking world.
I lived in Shanghai and Nanjing in mainland China for about 6 years. And then I moved to Taiwan, where I was in a city called Taichung for another 6 years. So I'm 36. So I've spent about a third of my life in the Chinese-speaking world, I guess.
And now he's helping others learn Chinese.
I am the COO and product manager of Yoyo Chinese, which is an online language learning platform, obviously, for learning Chinese that uses video courses and like other interactive features like flashcards and quizzes to help people learn to speak Chinese.
Jason has worked hard at learning Chinese, but he's had a lot of fun doing it. He is a great example of how there's no one way to learn a language. His is an experience we can all learn from. Let's get to it. Well, Jason, okay, we got the eternal question here. Why did you start learning Chinese?
That's a good question. I think if I really go really far back, and I remember being a really young kid talking to some friends of our family that my parents had from Hong Kong, and they gave me a hongbao. I was probably like 5 years old. Maybe that's where it started, I guess. But I think ultimately I just have a really curious spirit. The more different something is, the more interested I am in it, I guess. And that kind of carried through my academic life too. And so even in high school, I was studying some Japanese and Chinese, already interested in like East Asian culture through video games and comic books and stuff like that. And then I went to university, did a program in Japan. And then I also did a quick 3-week trip in China right after the program in Japan. And I just fell in love with China and decided to focus all of my East Asian interest on just China, and started learning Chinese on my own and decided to move there. I was like, hey, I'm going to move to China after I graduate from university, no matter what. So it was a general interest in the culture that slowly turned into more specifically learning the language.
Well, I do want to hear a little bit more about this. You said you got a hongbao when you were 5 years old. Now, this obviously made an impression on you, because I don't remember a whole lot from things when I was 5 years old, but obviously this stood out to you.
Yeah, and I don't either. I actually have a really bad memory when it comes to early childhood, but I remember May. Her name was May, and she was the wife of a friend of my parents, and she was from Hong Kong, and I remember her giving me that hongbao. I remember the apartment we were in and everything, and I remember them explaining it and telling me about Chinese culture and Hong Kong, and just being kind of fascinated with something that seemed very different, I guess.
Okay, but you got involved in a lot of this Asian culture aspect. But what actually tipped the scale to say like, okay, I'm actually going to focus like on Chinese? Because it sounded like Japanese was on your radar, but why was it Chinese?
I was equally interested in both, and just East Asian culture generally, even a little bit into Korean culture and language too. But the media that produced by Japan was far more interesting to me. I was more into Japanese video games and comic books, and even trying to download Japanese ports of video games and try to work my way through them. And my Japanese was pretty basic, so I didn't do a very good job of that. And then when I was in university, I started studying some philosophy, actually, East Asian philosophy as a part of my program there. And I had some professors, one in particular, Wudongshan or Shang Geling. And I took his class, and it was just awesome. He's just like the living embodiment of like a Taoist, and he's just a very interesting person. And he told me, oh, you should come to China, and so I did that kind of on his request. And once I got to China, I'd already been to Japan, and I loved my time in Japan. I still love Japan to this day. But at that time in my life, China was such a better fit for me personally, like my personality and the time. It was 2006, and China was really like, the economy was just blowing up, and there was so much energy. And just getting off the plane, like day one, I was like, man, this place is crazy. Like everybody here has so much energy, and it's so exciting. And the way people interact with you when you speak Chinese, especially back then, was just so much different than Japan. Like Japan, the the requirement for your Japanese to be good is much higher, right? People don't lush all over how good your language skills are like they did in China. So obviously that like ego boost kind of kept me interested too, just feeling like, hey, people really want me to speak this language. They really are excited when I'm speaking with them. And I think that really motivated me at that age. I was like 22 or whatever.
What was your Chinese like when you actually touched ground?
So I had gone to Japan, and I knew I was going to go to China. I had like a couple months in between, and I sat down with a friend of mine who I knew from the program in Japan, who had very excellent pronunciation in Chinese and very good Chinese, and said, hey, this is back in the States. Teach me as much as you can. And so I had a couple months to understand how the grammar worked on a basic level, word order, and he really drilled me on pronunciation and tones. I'll never forget that. That was a very important lesson for me. I didn't skip over them like some people might have been advised to do. And then by the time I got to China, I could introduce myself. I'm from America. How's it going? Let's go here, eat this. Very basic stuff. And then I did a program there. And then during that program, I was there for 3 months and I learned a lot. During that program, I spent a ton of time interacting with locals. I would leave every night, every day, every chance I had. I would go out and interact with people and practice speaking. So I got a ton of practice in.
Well, what was this program? I mean, was it a Chinese language program?
Technically, no. It was a philosophy program. Some of the Chinese language students, I wasn't in that program, but would join this program just because it was in China. And then like half of the students were from the philosophy classes and from that program. So it was kind of this like hybrid mix of philosophy and language. We were based in Shanghai and we went to Beijing, Xi'an, lots of cool places.
Well, I want to hear a little bit of like, what were you doing to learn the language? Because, I mean, Jason, you're friends with John.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, you're largely self-taught. So what were you doing to pick up the language?
After that program, I graduated and I moved to Shanghai immediately. And so then I was like, all right, here we go. I'm going to try to really learn. And I was living there. So I had 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to practice. And I had been using Chinese Pod during that program. So when I was there, I discovered Chinese Pod. This is before the iPhone even existed. So I was downloading MP3s from Chinese Pod to my iPod.
Wow. Those were the days, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. I had a little notebook and my iPod, and that's it. And then, of course, I had my texting phone, tap phone or whatever, but it didn't have apps or anything like that. So I even had an electronic dictionary. And my technique was basically Chinese Pod. I was like, wow, this is such a revolutionary way to learn. Like, I'm just listening to these really interesting hosts who have lots of experience and they're teachers explaining how to speak things and teach me the language. So I would listen to a lesson. I'd try to go out and use it right away. So I was really, really heavily on the Chinese Pod train. And it sounds like it's not enough, but if you're living in China, it really can be, especially if you're using it every day. I basically had a notepad. I had the MP3 player and I would just talk to everybody. I would talk to cab drivers and strangers and my baoan and all these different people. And I would write everything down. And then at the end of the day, I would cross out words that I didn't think I needed. One thing I did very intentionally was I didn't want to overload my brain with unnecessary vocabulary that I didn't think was useful because I was so early in my learning that, if I picked up the word for like missile or something, talking about politics, I remember for some reason I remember this. And I was like promptly just crossed it out. Like, no way, I'm not learning that. It was more of a strategic intention. I wasn't super structured in terms of like, okay, if 8 o'clock I do this, 9 o'clock I do this. It was like, give me all the resources I can get, jump in, and apply them as much as I possibly can and review them in the evening and ignore stuff that doesn't seem necessary and focus on essential proficiency.
It's great to hear this because a lot of times, people say, what is the right program? What is the right, and I really say that there's a lot of ways to learn a language and they all can work. It's just some can be more effective than others. It's a good case of you just used one resource, but when you combined it with all the other practice that you were doing, I mean, obviously it can be highly effective. It's just how you utilize the resources you have.
It was kind of doing it because I was just being scrappy. Like I didn't have the money or the desire to enroll in classes. I needed to work. So I was teaching English during the day for the first year or two. Obviously, living in China, people compliment you like we were already talking about, right? A lot about your Chinese excessively. And it can make you think your Chinese is better than it really is, right? But that time there made me feel like, hey, what I'm doing is working. And then people kept complimenting me on pronunciation. I do think I have maybe a natural affinity for that to some extent, but also those sessions with that friend of mine who was just so adamant that don't screw it up and focus on things other than pronunciation and tones right away. So it really drilled that home for me. And then people complimenting me and just saying, oh, you're doing so good. I was like, wow, this is working. So then I really got into this idea of, hey, we don't need classrooms anymore. And I feel like that's a normal thing to say these days. Like, oh, flipped classroom. Oh, learn outside the classroom. You can use these different resources. But back then, like, people didn't really talk that way. That wasn't so common to hear, right? So it felt like a revolutionary idea. And Chinese Pod was obviously on the precipice of that. And so it was just an exciting time to be there. I was just learning all on my own and feeling like, hey, if I stick to this strategy, let's see how good I can get kind of thing.
Well, Jason, what was keeping you motivated? Because it's not always easy to just get out there and just always practice your Chinese and like sticking to it. But like, what do you think really kind of kept you going?
If I'm being honest about that, I do think to some extent it was boosting my confidence just as a person, both professionally and socially, to have people, wow, your Chinese is really good. And feeling like, hey, I'm doing something that is impressive. Like, not that I hadn't done things like that before, but this was like the first thing in my life I felt that I was really experiencing like the rewards from, right? Like the more you learn, you're able to talk to people. So it's like very real. I kept thinking, what could I do with this? I don't even know, but it's just this opening all these potential doors. I'm like, I could be a translator. I could keep traveling around China.
Well, where did it lead you? Because, I mean, you're now involved in Chinese education, but like you started improving your proficiency. And what was this path that led you to where you are now?
As I improved and I felt like, hey, I'm really doing pretty well here, I started to kind of realize that translation could be a good way for me to pretty much learn while I was getting paid. I got some very basic translation jobs without even really a resume. I mean, at the time, it was a different world back then. So there weren't very many qualified translators for small jobs like this. And then that built up my portfolio, and then I got bigger jobs. And a lot of the times I would do these translations where I would open it and be like, I have no idea what this is even about. Like, it's very difficult for me to read it. But I worked through it, and I made sure, and I actually paid a tutor a couple times to look it over with me. So on the one hand, it seems kind of irresponsible looking back on it, but the clients were happy with the results, so it worked out. But from there, I was like, now I'm getting paid to learn Chinese. You know, how can I professionally integrate this idea of learning a foreign language with my career? And then, of course, my mind went right back to Chinese Pod. So I'd been translating for a couple years and got in touch with John. I knew John at this point. And
wait a second. I got to hear, how did you actually meet John?
I think it was at a party. It was a friend of a friend. We were at an apartment, and I was like, hey, you're the guy from Chinese Pod, and I love your stuff. And we just started talking about Chinese and kind of went from there.
You're not the only guy who had a man crush on John. It was me too.
You too?
Oh, yeah. I'd met him on a bus. You know, it was the only...
nice.
I had no idea who he was.
Oh, that's funny.
I didn't know he was a celebrity in the Chinese learning community at that point. But fast forward, roughly 8 years later, here we are. So
yeah, that's awesome. That's probably around the time that I left Shanghai then and I went to Taiwan. But I met him through there, and then I ended up working there.
Oh, wait, you worked at Chinese Pod?
Yep.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was fun. That was a really cool time to be in China. And I think it's still a cool place to be for sure. But that time in particular, it was like China was really blowing up and Chinese Pod was doing really well. There was all the other languages in the office were firing off. And that kind of like inspired me to be like, hey, I want to keep doing this. Even though I was ready to move on and go to Taiwan, I really wanted to keep working in quote unquote online Chinese language learning, using technology to teach and learn Chinese. Kind of eventually ended up at Yoyo Chinese.
Well, that's really interesting. Like, how did that all work out with Yoyo? And tell me, like, kind of what do you guys do there? Like, what do you do there at Yoyo?
Yoyo Chinese was founded by Yang Cheng about a couple years ago. And it's basically, instead of relying on just some games, like Duolingo has quizzes and these other apps and stuff, use a lot of very fun and useful games and stuff to learn, but they don't necessarily have the content in terms of like an actual course. And what Yoyo Chinese aims to do is kind of give the flipped classroom experience to some extent, where the video courses, the video lessons you're using in your courses feel a lot like you're sitting in a classroom, but with a fun teacher who with stories and teaches you the language in a step-by-step way. And then we cut up each lesson into like, it's only a 5, 6, 7-minute video. And then you do a quiz and you have flashcards. You still get all that interactive features that you would get from some other apps and some other websites, but you also have the more structured course approach. And so we have 3 conversational courses and 3 character courses. So you can choose not to do characters if that's not your thing and just focus on speaking, or you can do both. And it kind of takes you through, holds your hand and brings you through from beginner to what we call upper intermediate spoken Chinese, conversational Chinese, and integrates a lot of footage of on the street, real life people in China as well. So in addition to having this structure and having a very strict academic standards in terms of what's taught and how it's taught, we also use a lot of real life language to make sure that you don't come out of it like some people who only focus on textbooks do, where they're not prepared for the way people actually speak and how it really sounds, because the audio is, 你好，我是,
Yeah.
I was the product manager and now I'm also the COO, but I basically just help make sure that we are running the company in a way that is successful for our students.
So, Jason, I want to hear from you. Like, you've worked with a lot of Chinese learners, and especially everyone from beginners to, I imagine people who are more advanced. But I want to speak specifically about beginners and lower level learners. From your perspective, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing people when they say, hey, I want to start learning Chinese?
I think one really big one is just this psychological barrier that people have where speaking out a Chinese sentence exactly as you hear it feels silly, right? People feel silly speaking Chinese. It seems, I'm talking specifically from the perspective of an English speaker, like, oh, 你最近怎么样, right? Like, 最近怎么样? Like, if the way your mouth has to make these sounds and the tones in particular just feel so foreign to an English speaker that you almost feel silly doing it, right? Like and I can see it in people that they're not committing to the sound. And it's not necessarily that they can't make the sound, but that they don't want to. Like there's something in them that's holding them back. And it's kind of like this psychological barrier where they feel silly or just not able to commit to it. I think there's a number of things you can do to help with that. I've seen people who speak pretty good Chinese, but they still haven't really learned to almost like play the role of a Chinese speaker, right? Like they're acting or something. And I think,
that's an interesting point. As you mentioned that, I think about even saying the word Shanghai. Because, it's like, the proper way to say is Shanghai.
Right.
But, if you're around like other foreigners or people who are not speaking Chinese, you feel almost like obligated to say Shanghai.
Yeah. And you don't want to feel pretentious and say, oh, my favorite city is Shanghai. Like, like exaggerated. But speaking of the exaggerated, like, oh, ni hao, like doing that, I think is very helpful. One of the best experiences I had teaching a beginner was a very good friend of mine moved to Taiwan and he ended up living right next to me and we were there for years together. And I was constantly kind of coaching him while he was learning Chinese. And we would do exercises like that where it's like, just speak it out loud, act silly for a second and just try to imitate exactly what you hear, even if you feel like you're caricaturing it or whatever, because once you can get used to doing that, then it can become more like muscle memory and it becomes more natural. And I think the more you do this, Chinese people will reinforce it for you. Wow, 你中文说得很好，你的发音很标准.
I think that's, some real big challenges for learners at the beginning. Well, what about those type of learners who maybe don't have access to native speakers? They're not living in Taiwan or in China. What advice would you give to someone?
I would still say that speak out loud in your house by yourself and do the best you can to emulate the sounds you're hearing. You feel even sillier sitting by yourself speaking out loud like that. But I actually think that's really helpful because, learning a language, it's not a topic with information that you have to take in. To some extent, eventually vocabulary is that way. But generally speaking, right, it's more like a skill, like playing basketball or the guitar or something. And you just need to practice it, like as in muscle memory. You can't read a book about guitar and then be good at guitar, right? You have to practice every day. And language is the same way. So just speak it out loud as best as you can. And even using, reading out loud texts or anything like that, if you're reading, do it out loud. Don't just keep pouring information into your brain and then wondering why you're not able to output. Obviously, technology these days allows us to connect with people. So, there are a bunch of apps available out there to find tutors and, people who you can talk to through your phone or your computer. That I think that's a great idea too. Right off the bat, just start jumping into it socially with Chinese teachers and tutors. Even if you don't feel your level's good enough, just jump in. It'll be good for you in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's the best analogy I've heard, Jason. You can't read a book about playing guitar and then play guitar and be good at it, right? I do play guitar when I find a song that I want to learn. I look at the music and I'm like, okay, great. And then I have to start plucking it out. And it's hard that first time.
This is also very Taoist or whatever, like the flow state. Just like the guitar, it just becomes like muscle memory. So you've practiced it enough to where it just happens, right? And I think you want to get to that place with your language where you're not consciously thinking about everything you say. You've practiced it so much that it just is second nature and it just comes right out. And that really, those are the times when you're going to feel the best about your language. Like, oh, I just talked to that person for 10 minutes and I didn't even think about it, right?
There's that quote from Bruce Lee. He says, I'm not afraid of the guy who's practiced 10,000 different kicks. I'm afraid of the guy who's practiced one kick 10,000 times.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
It also reminds me of there's this other saying, I'm going to butcher this. I don't exactly remember verbatim, but it's something like a professional, like he practices enough so that he can't get it wrong. So like, musician, they'll practice it enough times so that he just can't get it wrong.
Exactly.
And it's practicing enough so that it's ingrained in your head.
Yep.
And I think, as far as, talking about some of the science of learning, we call that automatic processing. I have an idea, I open my mouth and the words come out.
Well, I should throw this in here. I never use vocabulary lists, ever. I never focus on memorizing lists of vocab. That just, to me, is just not the way my brain works, and it didn't seem productive to me, and so I never picked up that habit. I do think that works for some people, and I think depending on your goal, if you're going to read a text and it's filled with vocabulary that you have to learn, that makes sense. But if you're focusing on speaking and proficiency and stuff like that, it seemed like I was going to overload myself with stuff I didn't need, and so I never did that.
Well, Jason, if you could go back and you could do it over again, what would you do differently?
Good question. I would definitely focus more on reading and reading novels. In fact, a lot of the kind of the stuff that you guys produce with Mandarin Companion, to be honest, because I shored up that a little bit and improved it over time. But in the beginning, for like maybe the first 5 years, I was only focused on speaking. And I could read the words that were spoken because I was texting all day long and, translating Chinese pod dialogues, which are all spoken language. You're reading, but it's still spoken language, which is a different beast. When I tried to make that jump to reading, it was really challenging for me. I wish I would have done it differently, not because it's not a good way to learn the way I did it, but because I missed out on this like kind of enriching, cool experience of reading novels. And interestingly enough, comic books, I did read quite a bit of comic books, but comic books are all spoken language too. So I was still reinforcing my spoken language. I was still reinforcing dialogue, and that was helpful for what I was trying to accomplish. That didn't really allow me to jump straight into reading long form novels and stories and stuff like that. So I definitely wish I did more of that. Like now I'm trying to do it again. I hate reading. A lot of my books are Taiwanese, and so they go from the top to bottom, right to left or whatever. And I absolutely hate that.
That's hard.
Yeah.
Well, what kind of impact has literacy had on your Chinese?
It certainly helped. And I would say the comic books and reading dialogues was super helpful because I could imagine them being spoken out loud and kind of use the language I was learning that day, like step outside and use it, right?
Well, what advice would you give to someone who's learning Chinese today?
Go into it with an open mind and always keep in mind that you have this massive world of the Chinese speaking world out there that you're going to be able to tap into the more you learn. And that's a huge resource, just professionally, personally, socially. And it's so much fun. There's so much out there. So don't lose sight of that and don't get caught up on the challenges when they come up, because they will. And just kind of focus on the positive stuff. And I guess the other one would probably just be the psychological barrier stuff I was talking about earlier. Lean into it, like go nuts. And Chinese people love it. The more you speak, they're going to eat it right up and you'll have a great time doing it. Chinese is fun.
Well, Jason, where can people find you if they want to learn more about what you're doing?
I would go to yoyochinese.com. That's our website, and just check it out. We have courses, like I mentioned before, all the way up through upper intermediate. So depending on your level, we probably have something for you. And then we also have our character courses, the final of which is our character reader course, which uses comic books, physical comic books you can purchase online through Amazon, but also a motion comic version of it that's animated with voice lines and everything. So you can kind of watch the comic book. And we do videos on our YouTube channel. I'm sometimes in those videos, so you could find me there.
Well, Jason, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experience with us. It's been insightful to me, and I'm sure a lot of other people.
Yeah, no problem. It was my pleasure.
Well, John, that was quite the interview, if I must say so myself.
Because you did it.
I can't take all the credit, John. So jumping into it, one of the things that first stuck out to me when I was interviewing Jason is, he talked about how memories as a child influenced his interest in China. This was something that kind of stuck out to me because there have been different people I've interviewed for different reasons, not just for this podcast, but heard their stories. And I specifically remember one lady when she was very young, like 4 or 5 years old, her parents had this book and it was about some girl in China. And somehow it just sparked this interest in China. And so her whole life, she's wanted to learn Chinese, and she's in her 50s now, and she's been kind of off and on learning over the last 20 years. But, John, that was something I wanted to ask you is like, what were some of the first things that got you interested in learning Chinese? I mean, was it even on your radar at a young age?
I don't think it was, honestly. I mean, sure, we had Chinese food occasionally, but that didn't extend into some deep interest. Probably the biggest impact that any form of media had on me when I was younger was not for China, it was for Japan. And it was watching The Karate Kid Part 2, where Daniel-san goes to Japan. And it seems pretty corny in retrospect, but that's probably one of my earlier influences for East Asia.
Something I haven't really mentioned to you, John, I don't think you know this, but when growing up, my family was a host family for international students who would come to the States and learn English. Now, we had a lot of students, mainly from like Brazil and South America, but we had a lot of students that had come from China. And it was kind of interesting that I learned some really basic pronunciation of Chinese back when we had these students. It was interesting that I made a lot of friends and I really connected with a lot of the students, but I didn't really learn any Chinese, and it didn't really spark a big interest to learn Chinese. But here's something that it did do, and this weaves in through the story of Jason, is that I realized the importance of pronunciation. I've quickly learned that even when I was trying to say words that they were trying to teach me, that I had like this American accent. And I didn't like it. And I wanted to like try to say it the most authentic way possible.
Yeah, and I have to say that this really resonated with me as well. And also Jason has a really good accent in Chinese. And I think what he was saying really stood out to me. He was basically saying people are somewhat embarrassed to go full on, to really just throw aside all inhibitions and, try to shed their accent and to fully try to imitate an accent as well as the sounds of the language. And I've noticed that people who speak really well are good at imitating. Like someone who has a really good accent when they speak Chinese is frequently good at like doing a British accent in English or that kind of thing. That's really important if you want to get really good at pronunciation.
Yeah, and there's that confidence thing, because it's hard when you're first starting to learn that second language. You don't feel confident speaking it. You're like, am I saying it right? And then you're afraid to say it wrong. And I think sometimes it can be too easy to fall into that caricature of just like, oh, I'm an American learning Chinese, and so I have this American accent or whatever our native language is. So it can be hard to step out and really like say, hey, I'm going to really try to say this, not just, pronunciation wise, but provide the right intonation and the whole animation.
Yeah, and it's usually not something that you're going to try to do on day one. But once you feel like you've basically learned the sounds of the language, it's not enough to repeat them like some kind of sound out of a textbook. You want to imitate living language. You want to imitate real people and try to get their intonation and their little quirks. Try to imitate all that. And if you can do that, then you're going to get much more interesting results and you'll actually have more fun with it.
Oh, that's so true. That's so true. In fact, John, I'm curious to hear about you, like back in the States and you're around family or friends that don't speak Chinese. What do you say? Do you say Shanghai or Shanghai?
I think I do say Shanghai.
I got to admit, I do too. You don't want to sound pretentious, right? You think like, oh yeah, so back in Shanghai, we
Yeah, but also, I grew up monolingual. I didn't learn any language decently until my teens, and not really well until I was in China in my 20s. So Shanghai is the natural default in my brain, right? Don't forget who you are, man.
Yeah. Quite true. Quite true. I think it's moves beyond that pronunciation too, because like when you're trying to speak the language, it's not just pronouncing it right. It's getting that flow, getting a bit of that rhythm. And I think as Jason put it, kind of playing that role, playing the caricature of a Chinese speaker. That's also another skill in order to acquire.
Yeah, and this is one area I think that movies can help. I remember one of the movies that I watched early on, which I felt helped with this, was The Emperor's New Groove, the Disney movie, dubbed in Mandarin. And the main role, that's played by David Spade, it was dubbed by a Taiwanese person. And I found that trying to imitate those lines really got a lot of laughs from my Chinese friends because it was quirky. And, it was unlike how anyone I knew talked. And it was fun.
I think this is an overarching theme in the interview with Jason. It's just about this, like being able to get that feel for speaking, the pronunciation, because it's interesting to hear how people learn the language. And he was largely self-taught. He was just like Chinese pod and just out on the street talking to people, just talking to everybody. And, that's essential. Like if you want to get fluent, you have to practice and use the language.
Yeah, and you did that too, right?
Yeah, in fact, that's how I started. I mean, gosh, I can remember when I first came to China. God, that was 2010, January 14th, 2010. Wow. It's been a long time. But anyway, yeah, I had started learning like Chinese from like a program I had bought online, and I had some very basic stuff when I got to China. But when I got there, I went by myself. I was married and we had 2 kids, but I came over first for 3 months before I brought my family over. And during that time, I lived with this roommate, and he spoke really good Chinese. He was a foreigner. Von Wilhelm, thanks, man. Shout out to you. And, he really encouraged me to like learn Chinese. And what I found myself doing, he's just like, just speak, just try speaking. And so I did. I just, whatever I knew, I would just try to say it. And we had this ai at the house. And man, I'm telling you, I struggled so hard to communicate, with her. But I tried. Like, I remember one time I was sitting with her for like 10, 15 minutes, just trying to tell her I was going to go out and be back in a half an hour. And then once we finally communicated, then I wanted to figure out how to write it. And so she's trying to do this. And then I was learning these little components of the characters. And yeah, it got frustrating at some point, but it just stuck with it and I tried.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's interesting about this approach is just, forcing yourself to talk, is that it's hard for anyone because you're bad at the language in the beginning. But for some personality types, it's especially harder. So I think for you and also for Jason, you're kind of naturally outgoing. You like to talk. I think you have an advantage there. It's not quite as hard because you don't have to go against your personality. You just have to go against your pride and your horrible pronunciation in the beginning, right? But like for
Exactly.
me, I had to change my personality. Like I had to play mind games with myself. Like I had to pretend like I was someone else to go out and talk to people I didn't know and be more outgoing than I normally would. And in fact, yesterday I just talked to a new client at All Set Learning, and he was telling me he's not too naturally outgoing, but one thing that he did was he went and lived with a host family in Anhui province. So, homestay is good practice. But what he would do during the day was not go to Chinese lessons. He would go to a coffee shop, and he would just have a coffee and have his Chinese notes and stuff. And all day long for like 6 months, what he would do is he would wait for people to come into the coffee shop. When he saw someone, by themselves who didn't look too busy, he would ask them if he could just like sit with them and talk with them and buy them a coffee. And they would almost always say yes.
Wow.
So he would just have random conversations with people like over and over, day after day. And his Chinese is quite good now. So I found that really impressive.
That's a pretty cool story. Something I remember, John, is when I got there, Vaughn, he taught me how to say 好久不见. So, long time no see. And he would just say, it was just kind of a funny thing to say, especially when you just met someone. Or it was like we go to the fruit stand, he was like, oh, just tell me 好久不见, And so I practiced that. And so when I just meet people, I'd be like, oh, 好久不见. And they'd be kind of like chuckle and they laugh. And so that was always like really motivating, just kind of making people laugh because of my simple, silly Chinese. But that's important, when you give that positive reaction, that's really engaging. And that's, Jason, he talked about that. I remember asking him, says, what kept you motivated? And he says, it was like a constant rewards, a very positive, virtuous cycle of reinforcement, of feedback. It was like this constant confidence boost for him. And that could take you really far in learning a language.
Well, the other thing about that is that I think it's becoming less and less. Like foreigners that speak Chinese well are becoming more and more common. So I think the cultural tendency to praise like crazy any foreigner that speaks any Chinese, I think that's finally dying down just a little bit. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what our listeners think about this. I came to China 20 years ago, almost. It's not the same reaction now. And in fact, I find it quite refreshing that in Shanghai, I can talk to a lot of people throughout my day and not get any comments on my Chinese. They just talk to me like a normal person. And that would have been unheard of, 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, that reminds me, once I took a trip out to Wudongshan, and that's like one of the holy mountains. So that's supposed to be the birthplace of Tai Chi. It's about north of Wuhan. And I think, in the 2 days we were up there, I saw like 2 other foreigners. And so there was all just Chinese people up there. It's kind of out in the sticks. And I remember we were hiking up the mountain, and along the way, there was these little, noodle shops and little convenience stores. The higher up you get, the fewer they become. But we stopped to get some noodles, and we're sitting outside, like under this big tree, and there's a lot of people sitting around there. And the waiter came around. My Chinese was really basic at that time. But Reed Smoot is his name. And so Reed, he spoke very good Chinese, and he just ordered like some noodles for us in Chinese. And this Chinese guy, who was just this, he was maybe like in his 30s, and he's just sitting at the table next to us. He had like his mouth full of noodles, and all of a sudden he's like,他会说中文. He's like, he can speak Chinese. And like these noodles were just dropping out of his mouth into the bowl below him. He was just so astonished, But, I think what happens, John, is like, in Shanghai and other large cities where there's a lot of foreigners, I think people are they're more used to that, right? But you get into these small areas or small towns or places where there's not a lot of foreigners, people are they're surprised.
Yeah, and it also depends on who you talk to, like within a city. If you're talking only to like well-educated young people and they all speak English, then they probably all know Chinese-speaking foreigners. But if you want to talk to old people, or if you want to talk to, people sweeping the streets or the guards, entrances, the gates, all kinds of people that maybe just don't have that kind of contact, then you can probably get some of that ego boost, people praising your Chinese if that's what you're looking for. And I have to admit, it is nice.
It's just like that Mama Hoo Hoo video. We talked about this before in one of the podcasts, but those guys, they lived in China for a long time. They're like in New York, and they're reminiscing. They're like having withdrawals from being back in America, missing China. And then these two girls that sit in the table next to them, they start speaking Chinese, and they're like, and so they start trying to speak Chinese to them, and they like ignore them, and they follow them around the city. And then finally they're like lost, and they give them some directions in Chinese. And then they're finally like, 你的中文不错. And they're like, oh. Then they're like, the euphoria waves over them, They were just waiting for that compliment there.
Right. So don't get too addicted because it can change your life. Maybe not for the better.
Words of wisdom. I think this is something that's illustrated in his story, though, is about the power of like mass exposure of the language at like a comprehensible level. And getting back on this, because he said that, he was self-taught and he pretty much only had like Chinese pot. A lot of times we talk about here is, like deliberate instruction, based on a lot of the research should maybe be about like 25%. But the rest of that time is about, different types of practice around that and, doing output and speaking and fluency practice. And this is something that really stuck out in his story is that, he just got out there and just spoke, just try.
Right. Because remember, as he was saying, language is a skill. You can't just read about it. You got to go out and practice. And that's something I did, something you did. It definitely works. So do not neglect the practice of the skill. No matter how well you know it, no matter how many times you've gotten it right in your spaced repetition flashcard deck, if you're not out there practicing it, coming up with the words you need on the spot and stringing them together in a sentence, building that skill, then you're not building your fluency.
He gave the best analogy. Like, I don't know why I never came up with it before. He's like, you can't just read a book about guitar and then be able to play guitar. I mean,
you can't.
It makes so much sense when you put it that way. So it's like, hey, I've studied my textbook. I've gone through all of my flashcards. I'm studying, but I still can't like pass the test, or I can't really speak, or I can't have a conversation. Well, yeah, it's the same thing. It's like if you have this book on guitar and you just keep reading it and reading about the finger positions and about, look at the sequence and about different techniques and stuff, but you're not practicing. It doesn't matter how many times you read that book. If you don't practice, you won't get better at guitar.
Precisely.
I'm going to be using that analogy like to the end of my days, John.
I could tell you like it. Okay, so Jared, before we got into this interview, I sensed that you really wanted to hear more about how I helped Jason learn how to translate for academic purposes. You want to get into that now?
Oh, please tell me. Please.
All right, so when Jason came to Chinese Pod, he was a translator. His Chinese was already quite good. But one thing that's interesting is no matter how good of a translator you are, if you haven't done translation for the purposes of learning a language, then you're not going to be doing it in the most user-friendly way. So to give a simple example, if you have the Chinese sentence, 今天我有课, so today I have a lesson. Now, you could easily translate that word for word. But if the translator is like, I think it's more natural to say, I have a lesson today. In English, we like to put today at the end. Well, yeah, you could do that. But if the person is just starting to learn this sentence, these words, why would you not make it a little easier on them and then put the English word in the same order as the Chinese and say, today I have a lesson? And there's just a lot of little things like that. Translators tend to go for the most natural selection, but often the most natural translation will use different grammar, vocabulary that kind of tricks you. And sometimes you have to go against your naturalness instincts to provide the translations that are actually helpful to the learner and don't go down some weird detour, that they don't need until they've been studying for 6 months.
Oh, that's a really good point. I mean, that's why translation, it's more than just exact word for word translation, right? There's interpretation that gets
right. So that's your skill. That's part of your skill set to not do word for word translation. And it's not that word for word translation is always the best translation, but you just have to think about what is going to be most useful to this learner. I think quite a while ago, we talked about something called cognitive load. Like how much does the learner have to hold in their memory, like in the RAM, to try to understand what's going on? And so you want to reduce that load. You want to make it easier for them. And as much as possible, get out of the way. Like they understand and they keep going. Like I'm not a big fan of translation as a learning method. Like that's one of the really traditional ways to learn a language. You have a text and then you translate it. Language is for communication, so you always want to focus on communication. But obviously in the beginning, translation is an important tool that you can use. And so we wanted to help you and not confuse you. So I helped Jason with that way back in the beginning. He got really good at it. So now his Chinese is just all around awesome, and he's doing cool things that I wish I could do. Stuff like comic books and, all in Chinese. That's cool.
Yeah, that was cool stuff. But on that translation thing, I don't remember if I mentioned this in the previous podcast, but I went to a military language conference about a month ago here in Utah.
Are you allowed to talk about this?
And look, it was open to the public. I mean, I just registered and went, and I was surprised at things they were talking about there out in the open, but whatever. And everyone at this conference was usually attached to the military somehow, and they were linguists, so they were learning their language, and they're supposed to be able to help the military intelligence. But they had this guy, he spoke Arabic, and he has Arabic background, but what he was talking about is machine translation. It's actually getting better and better. Accuracy is improving, but what a lot of the machine translation misses is the context and the cultural understanding. And he shared a number of stories that were very interesting about that. But then he explained, in his opinion, the future of translators in the military and probably in other areas is not necessarily their ability to just know the language, but it's their ability to understand the culture. And so that they can be able to provide the proper context for the language and understand the real meaning that's being conveyed.
Right. Sometimes those subtleties could make or break a negotiation.
Yeah. And I think in his thing, he was talking about Arabic, and even talked about some interesting military intelligence. Like in Oman, he talked about these villages where this one analyst, she got the cultural understanding of how these villages communicate, how decisions were made. And it's something like where the village gets together around the well in the middle of the town, and they start talking in poems. And they use these poems to illustrate their points. And the person who they agree with, they start lining up behind that person. So they kind of crowd around the person that they're agreeing with. They literally vote with their feet. And that's how decisions get made in these little towns and in these little tribes. And that was fascinating. I'm like, wow, that's important, right?
That sounds like something that Google Translate does not cover.
Definitely not. But Jason, when I asked him, I said, hey, if you could do it all over again, what would you do? He brought up again, reading. And this is something we're always banging this drum, right, John? Hey, reading's so important. I say this, that reading develops your language in ways that speaking cannot. He's like, hey, if I had Mandarin Companion back when I was learning, I would have done it. It was interesting, too, because, he's working on comic books, and they have a lot of comic books on Yoyo Chinese, but he's like, but comic books are largely spoken language, and you miss something out when you're actually reading literature or you're reading a book.
Yeah, the style of language is quite different. The grammar patterns, the vocabulary, it's all quite different. And if you don't ever read literature, poems, or whatever, then you're kind of missing out on the beauty of the language. And it's not something you want to jump into too early, but it's cool that nowadays, because of things like graded readers, you can start down that road. I wouldn't say that our graded readers are the epitome of beauty of written Chinese. They're simple and they're fun stories, but it's the first step down that road. If you really want to appreciate Chinese culture in its fullness, then you don't want to miss out on that.
And this is also one of the other ways that you get access to the language. If you're listening here and you don't have access to native speakers, and you want to get this mass amount of input, like people who are sharing their stories on this podcast, I lived in China for 5 years. Well, they're like, well, yeah, if I lived up there for 5 years, my Chinese would be a lot better too. I just don't have the opportunity to speak. Well, the key thing about living in the country is that you're going to get opportunities to get a lot of input and then, of course, generate output. Well, books also give that opportunity for you to get a lot of input if you read a lot. And then from the books, you can start using activities to generate output. And we covered that on one of our previous podcasts.
which you would know if you've listened to everything, as I'm sure you have.
That was our last podcast, I think. Yeah, exactly. And that was our last podcast. If you want to figure out okay, if I want to be able to get a lot of input and generate output, well, listen to the last podcast number 33. It was writing Chinese, how to build your skills. So yeah, you can get a lot of practice in the language without having to live in China. Well, that was an insightful interview, and I'm glad we had this chance to talk about it. So let us know how you think this one went today.
All right, so next up, we have a word from our sponsor.
And our sponsor is
Mandarin Companion.
Imagine that.
So today we're going to talk about one of our breakthrough level books. It is an awesome book. It is one of the easiest sci-fi stories you could possibly read in Mandarin Chinese, and it also has a pretty awesome cover.
Oh, yes. It is My Teacher is a Martian.
All right, and today we're actually going to share with you something that we haven't done before, but it's what are readers saying about this particular book?
Yes, because we can tell you how awesome it is, but let's hear from One-Eyed Jax on Amazon, who's a verified purchase. He says, these breakthrough readers are a very important spoke in the wheel of your Mandarin learning. I can't tell you how helpful these have been for me for character recognition and also for cementing some of the grammar points common in the beginner level. These books only have 150 characters, but of course that means they really contain so much more. For a beginner, learning how different characters combine in different ways make up different words, ideas, is very helpful. Beyond all those practical points, the stories are actually interesting. Find out what happens with the benzi. I'm thankful that these greater readers exist and that I have many higher levels to aspire to. So there you go.
And I should also mention, Jared, that we've been hard at work converting all these breakthrough level stories to traditional characters. So those are coming out very soon. By the time this podcast is published, they probably still won't be out, but they'll be almost out.
The release week, we should have them out, at least an ebook. So go out and get it today. It is My Teacher is a Martian, Mandarin Companion, breakthrough level, 150 character graded reader. You can get it on Amazon, Kobo, iBooks, or wherever you get your books and stuff.
My Teacher is a Martian. Awesome.
Now, time for rants and raves. John, what do you have for us today? Do you have a rant or do you have a rave?
So I have a rave. It is in theme with one of the things we talked about in today's podcast related to translation. So if you're a Chinese learner, you've probably been told by your Chinese teacher, don't use Google Translation, because Google Translate is, it's probably not going to help your Chinese. But one of the things that's cool about Google Translate is it also has pinyin support. You might not realize this, but you can put in Chinese and it'll translate the English, but you can ignore that and use the pinyin. That can be really useful. And one thing that people in China might not realize is that even though Google is blocked in China, you can go to google.cn and it's different. The Google Translate at google.cn is not blocked in China. You can actually, use Google to translate and to get the pinyin in China without any kind of, special magic to get around the block. So that's very cool.
Yeah, and about 10% of our listeners are in China, so that's translate.google.cn.
It's good. Okay, well, Jared, what do you got? Rant or rave?
All right, I have got a rave. Hey, we're staying positive, man. I got to give a shout out to my wife, Heather.
Come on, this is not You Have a Great Wife podcast.
Well, she's doing some great stuff right now. I got to give her a shout out. So right now she is working with the Chinese teachers in our school district. So we have a Chinese dual-immersion program here. And as with the continuing COVID crisis right now, school is still canceled here in the States, and I know in many different places around the world. And so these kids aren't able to go to school. Now, one of the problems that we're encountering is that there are a lot of parents who are now trying to help their kids with Chinese, where previously they were at school in these dual immersion programs or with high school or whatever, and they've got these teachers, they're able to interact directly with the students, and that's important. But right now they can't. And so they're stuck to Zoom meetings, and we're finding out kids are tuning out. I mean, that's happening everywhere, right? Right. Class meeting, and they're actually playing a video game or something with what's going on. So I did find my son doing that once. Anyway, I'm like, turn that off. Anyway, but what she's working with right now is with the Chinese teachers to help create some of the materials for parents, to help them just maybe learn basic pinyin, understand some of the basics of Chinese, and help give them tips and ideas for parents to be able to help their kids who are trying to learn Chinese during this quarantine period. And so it's pretty cool. She had started a website a little while back. It's called Little Dragons Academy, littledragonsacademy.com. And so I just want to give a shout out to her. And if you guys are find yourself, anyone here is listening, maybe a parent or you know someone who maybe could use some help for their kid, go check out littledragonsacademy.com. There are a lot of videos, and she's not creating a lot of content. She's mainly like kind of creating a resource page. So there you go. That's my rave.
Cool.
John, are you a parent of a child who's learning Chinese?
I am, but I'm also a parent with a wife who is Chinese, and my kids are learning the, Chinese for Chinese kids, and I am happy to let my wife be the taskmaster when it comes to learning Chinese, and I handle English and sometimes math.
Well, cry me a river. Well, never mind then. I guess you're not in her target demographic. But anyway.
Yeah, sorry. I do have to learn
right.
some of those math methods that are different from what I learned when I was little, so maybe that's kind of the same thing.
Hey, man, how the Chinese teach math is highly effective. I mean, it's really good.
All right, so I think this is maybe the first time in any podcast we've ever done where I get to say goodbye at the end of the podcast.
Okay, fine. Well, goodbye.
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 Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
再见.
Dang
Bye-bye
it.
now.
You got me, John. Fine. Fine, you can say it. Say bye.
再见. Bye.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, backyard campout survivalists, homeschool teacher, painter, and that one guy named Dawson. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at mandarincompanion.com. Apologies to John Cena, we just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is James Harper. I'd like to thank our special guest, Jason Schuurman, and I'd like to thank my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Pasden. See you next time.